So Throne of Glass might be one of the most confusing fantasy series out there, and I'm not talking world building, I'm talking about what order do you read these books in? It is a book talk favorite series written by the apparent queen of the romantasy genre, maybe even its inventor, Sarah J. Maas. It has sold 38 million copies worldwide, which until yesterday is what I thought the population of Canada was. That's my bad. Still, that's a lot of people. Yet somehow, despite being read by millions of people worldwide, no one has a clue how you're actually supposed to read this series. And I mean no one. Not the publisher, not Sarah J. Maas herself. The fans certainly can't agree on anything. So what's the deal? It's like Throne of Glass is this uncrackable enigma you have to solve before you can even open the very first page. How many series do you know where you need a game plan before you can even pick up book one? How many series do you know where no one even knows what book one is? If you're like me and you spend time on Book Talk, Reddit forums, anything like that, you've probably seen some variation of this debate where someone will excitedly hold up a copy of a Throne of Glass book, say they're starting the series for the first time, and just be bombarded with comments telling them that they're doing it wrong. And while some of these recommendations are well-meaning, if a little overwhelming for a first-time reader, others are just flat out wrong. And for some reason, everyone is so loud about it. Well, in this video, I have decided to attempt to dissect, do a deep dive into the Throne of Glass series, specifically its reading order and why it is so incredibly confusing and controversial among fans. There will be no major series spoilers in this video, so you are totally safe to stay and watch if you haven't read the series, and maybe by the end you can decide which reading order is right for you, and I can teach you which one is absolutely wrong. To make this easier, and because I've been watching a lot of Jenny Nicholson videos, I'm going to divide this into 6 easily digestible chapters so that we all know where we're going with this story. And if you say this video is too long, no it isn't, okay? I have not had a chance to write an English essay in years. This was very exciting for me. Hopefully someone watches. And if you stick it out to the end, I will reveal my preferred reading order for Throne of Glass, which is what I believe is the correct one. Chapter 1. What the heck is Throne of Glass? No, you cannot skip this chapter, and yes, you probably already know what the Throne of Glass series is, but unless you've been following the series since publication in 2012, you probably don't even realize how convoluted this series has been since its inception. Personally, I discovered the series in 2016 when I found a signed copy of Empire of Storms at my local bookstore. My sister already owned a couple of them and had actually DNF'd it after finding out that one of the love interests was her cousin. We can talk about that another time. But anyways, I got into it in 2016, have not looked back since. It is my favorite Sarah J. Maas series. I think it is her best series, but that does not mean I think it is easy to read or that it makes perfect sense. But Throne of Glass goes back way further even than 2012 when it was originally published by Bloomsbury. Sarah J. Maas started writing this series when she was 16 years old, and it was published on fictionpress.net, which was like the sister website to fanfiction.net, which was like the precursor to AO3. This all goes way back.
I first realized I wanted to be published when I was 16 years old and I started writing Throne of Glass and seeing the reaction that my fans had on the Fiction Press website. It was kind of my fans as I was writing it that kept me going and ultimately encouraged me to get published.
She got very popular on there with what was then called Queen of Glass. It was a Cinderella-style retelling pitched as if Cinderella went to the ball not to dance with the prince, but to kill him. You can still find copies of this floating around online. It is not ideal. I don't think any of us want to be judged for what we wrote when we were 16 years old. And to be honest, by the time we eventually got Throne of Glass, the Cinderella aspect was just kind of diminished slightly. It was less of a retelling and more of an inspiration. But eventually Sarah J. Maas signed with Bloomsbury Publishing for 3 books total. And I will be using my laptop for notes because there's a lot in here. 2012 was kind of like the golden age of YA publishing. Think like Hunger Games and everything was getting really big. So Bloomsbury wanted to drum up some excitement for this, and to do that they released 4 prequel novellas as exclusive ebooks. These were The Assassin and the Pirate Lord, The Assassin in the Desert, The Assassin in the Underworld, and The Assassin in the Empire. This is important to remember, folks. that the novellas were originally released before the Throne of Glass book was even released to the public. You might think this makes it cut and dry. You would be wrong. But anyways, in 2012, Throne of Glass hits the shelves. It is moderately successful, and then the second book, Crown of Midnight, comes out. That hits the New York Times bestselling list. We are on our way to being a very successful series. Congratulations, Sarah J. Maas. Around now is when SJM or her team or both decided it would be a great time to complicate things. There are a couple of explanations for what happened next. Some seem more plausible to me than others. The one that makes the most sense is after the success of Crown of Midnight, or as they realized it was going to be successful, Sarah J. Maas was ultimately signed or committed to writing more books in the series, stretching it from those original 3 books to what eventually would be an 8-book series. In that moment, she probably realized the world needed to expand a lot more, and all readers needed to be aware of how this world had expanded. So, in response to Crown of Midnight's success, they repackaged those original ebook novellas and added a bonus novella called The Assassin and the Healer, and that was published in paperback form and it hit the shelves. Here's our second piece of the puzzle, everyone. The Assassin's Blade hits shelves after Crown of Midnight. You might see now why people are getting a little bit confused about things. She then follows up Assassin's Blade with the rest of the books in the main series, Heir of Fire, Queen of Shadows, and Empire of Storms. Empire of Storms very famously ends on an insane cliffhanger, and yet for some reason they decided to follow that up with Tower of Dawn, which to this day remains one of the strangest publishing decisions I've ever seen. Don't worry, we will get into that, because that also plays into our reading order debate. But eventually they get it all back on track, and Kingdom of Ash, the final book in the series, this horrible yellow book right here, comes out in 2018. You might be thinking this timeline is a little bit irrelevant, but there's really 2 things I want you to take away from here. The first is that Throne of Glass was originally signed for 3 books only. So at a certain point, whether that was during Crown of Midnight, I think probably as she was writing Crown of Midnight, Sarah J. Maas became aware that she was going to have a lot more books in this series, needed to expand this world, needed to start building for that, and thus the Assassin's Blade prequels were drawn back into focus. But also importantly, around the time that Queen of Shadows released, Sarah J. Maas also released ACOTAR. The first A Court of Thorns and Roses book came out at the same time, I believe the same year, as Queen of Shadows. ACOTAR, if you have not read it, is a much spicier, much more adult series, and while it was originally also put in the YA section, everyone can agree it is not the same tone as the Throne of Glass books. And it is also around this time that Sarah J. Maas started brainstorming Crescent City, her most recent series, and that would come much later on. So while Throne of Glass started as a 3-book tiny series, it was then expanded to not only be an 8-book series, but to tie in thematically with an adult-themed ACOTAR and a Sarah J. Maas multiverse. We are not getting into multiverse stuff in this video. I would not do that to you. A few months ago, I posted a TikTok video of my preferred Throne of Glass reading order, and people got heated in the comments about the Throne of Glass reading order. Some people agreed with me, some people disagreed violently, and a lot of people were talking about dying on hills. So let's get into the options and why people feel so strongly about each particular reading order. Which brings us to chapter 2. Too many choices. Everywhere you go, even on the Wikipedia, there is mention of 3 different reading orders for Throne of Glass. There is publication order, which is what I just listed above, where Assassin's Blade takes place or is read after Crown of Midnight. Apparently people also call this the emotional reading order. I have never heard anyone call it that, but that's what Wikipedia says it's called, so that's the emotional reading order. There is also something called the romantic reading order, where Assassin's Blade is read after Heir of Fire. Do not ask me why this is considered the more romantic option. I think they just picked an appealing adjective to try to sell people into their propaganda. You could also read it in chronological order, where you read the 5 Assassin's Blade novellas before you even open book 1 of Throne of Glass. Not to give too much away about my preferred reading order, but people feel very strongly about reading this series in chronological order, and I feel very strongly that they're wrong. And also, just to confuse things, there is something called the tandem read, which has you read Tower of Dawn and Empire of Storms at the same time, switching between each book on a chapter-by-chapter basis. These 2 books do take place at the same time in the timeline, but they weren't meant to be read at the same time, and I think people mainly do this to combat the nonsensicality of Tower of Dawn's existence. There's a complex guide for the tandem read, people jump through it, it seems fun. We'll get into it later. Are you confused yet? There are 3 possible reading orders, 1 bonus tandem read you could do, and people will yell at you no matter which one you choose. So let's get into why the different ones exist. This brings us to chapter 3, quality control. I feel like I need to start this section with a little bit of a disclaimer. Firstly, I do love this series and I don't want you to forget that. Anything I say about this is said with love for this series. Sarah J Maas started writing Throne of Glass when she was 16, and I don't think it is fair to judge anyone by what they created when they were 16 years old. Lord knows if that was me, there would be a lot of 39 Clues fanfiction on my resume. And once she was picked up by a publisher, she then wrote the next 2 books without a clear view for the expanded universe it would become or even how many books she would have in this first series. As a result, the first 2 books are a very different tone and quality than the later books in the series. This is due to her getting potentially more skilled with age and also knowing what kind of epic she was trying to write. And again, this is no one's fault. Everyone gets better with age. Everyone figures out their vision as they go through. It is not normal to know exactly what you're doing with something the day you start a project. Even though some of Sarah J Maas's recent releases would suggest that maybe quality doesn't always get better, but that is another video. The point of this is, I think even the most die-hard Sarah J Maas fans will agree with me that Crown of Midnight and Throne of Glass do not feel the same quality as the rest of the series. This next bit is purely my personal opinion, but I think Heir of Fire is one of the best examples of opening a fantasy world Sarah J Maas has ever done. It basically blasts open this world from a very small one-city setting into a world of multiple continents, multiple characters, POV characters outside of our original love triangle, and we also get POV characters who are older than teenagers, and this really changes the tone of the series, but we don't get here until book 3. So even though many people will say the Throne of Glass series is awesome, it doesn't necessarily start that way. I think it starts pretty fun and good, but it's hard to sell someone on what feels like a very YA series at the start if they're an adult fantasy reader. Especially if they're coming from Sarah J Maas's other works, which start and finish on the same tone they started. I'm kind of a crazy person, so I would probably still go for it, but most people aren't going to pick up a series if you're telling them it doesn't actually get good until you're 1,000 pages in. So we need a strategy. We need a way to recommend this series to people where they have a way to clearly see how good this series is going to become from the very start, and they won't get bogged down by the slightly more juvenile tones of the first one. This, I think, is where people get really hung up on the chronological order. As I said, some of these Assassin's Blade novellas were published prior to Throne of Glass, but the writing quality I think is a little bit higher. I do not know off the top of my head if these were edited before they were republished later on in the series. But the point is, the quality's good. It shows you how open the world is going to be, and it gives you some really important background information on characters that might not be the most likable at the start of the Throne of Glass series. So people will often say, start with Assassin's Blade, you get a taste of what you're getting into, and then just go back to Throne of Glass and Crown of Midnight, push your way through, and you're gonna love it. I hate this. That's maybe mean. My problems with this reading order are threefold. Personally, I would rather read a series knowing it is going to get better with every single book than read a decent book, 2 bad books, and then go back to some good books. Again, I'm exaggerating here. Are they truly bad? I don't know, but I'm just saying that is totally my personal preference. This kind of puts you on like a roller coaster of quality, and I feel like that makes it harder to expect what you're getting rather than stuff consistently going up in quality as you read. Problem 2, the events of the Assassin's Blade don't really become relevant until book 4, Queen of Shadows. That means if you read Assassin's Blade first, you then have to spend the next 3 books remembering who Rolf and Ansel and Lysandra are. And yes, I did have to Google Ansel because I could not remember her name. And then hope that it still hits a punch as you're trying to remember who these people are when you finally meet them again later in the series. Not to mention, I think a lot of Celaena's character growth is massively undercut if you know her entire backstory before you even meet her. Part of the reason this series works is because Celaena is unlikable at the start to a lot of readers, and then you get to know her. But if you start with her backstory, a lot of that intention just isn't there. So you're kind of missing some of the character growth that we're supposed to be getting. And thirdly, I just fundamentally believe that a prequel is meant to be read after you've seen or read the original material. You need the context of the story to care about the prequels. Maybe I'm treading into murky waters here, but I don't think the Star Wars prequels would mean nearly as much if we didn't already know who Darth Vader was, or if we didn't care about Luke and Leia. You learn to care about the characters, you learn to care about the universe, and then you really drive home the emotional punch with the Assassin's Blade. If you do it the other way around, it doesn't work. I also think it's worth noting at this point that the 4 originally published Assassin's Blade novellas that were published prior to Throne of Glass were published as optional bonus ebooks. I don't know if you guys remember 2012, but this was before Kindle Unlimited was all the rage. No one was reading ebooks, or not many people were reading ebooks, or they weren't reading them before they'd read Throne of Glass. They were reading Throne of Glass, and then they were finding out there was additional material they could go read. And it wasn't until Sarah J. Maas expanded the universe that they became required reading. At that point, she added another novella and republished them. I think at the point in the series where they become required. And by the time she decided you needed to have read them, most people had already read and enjoyed the first 2 without touching the Assassin's Blade novellas. Maybe you can tell, but I feel like this is the reading order that gets people the most passionate and angry on the internet. They were certainly the most vocal in the comments on my TikTok video, and I think that's kind of embittered me towards this reading order in general. I get being vocal about something you love. I get wanting people to have the most emotional, the most exciting experience they can possibly have. But I think if you're seeing someone pick up a book series you love, and rather than just sharing in their joy, you're immediately letting them know they're doing something wrong, that might be a problem. And also, if you can't get invested in a character without knowing her entire backstory first, that might be a you problem, not a problem with the book. Sorry. Now on to something a little bit lighter. Chapter 4, The Chaol Problem. Whether you said his name Chaol or Chaol or whatever the heck in between, you can all admit that we had a Chaol problem. Empire of Storms is, I think, possibly the best book Sarah J. Maas has ever written. And it ends on one of very few cliffhangers that has ever genuinely had me just desperate for the next book. I know many, presumably millions of readers felt the same way. And yet for some reason, Bloomsbury and Sarah J. Maas decided to follow up the cliffhanger of Empire of Storms with Tower of Dawn.
I just want to clarify that Tower of Dawn, it's the 6th Throne of Glass book, but it is not it's not a sequel to Empire of Storms. It's basically it takes place during Empire of Storms with Chaol and Nesrin and then a whole bunch of other characters.
Tower of Dawn to me feels like Sarah J. Maas wrote her characters into a problem more complex than they were capable of solving. And the only way she could see out of this was to write a side quest novel in which a different character who isn't too invested in the main story can go off, find the answers we need, and then bring them back to our team. Part of this is because at this point we were fully into ACOTAR, we were fully beginning the Crescent City journey, and I think the world was just bigger than Sarah J. Maas's core Throne of Glass crew could handle. So, in Tower of Dawn, we ditch pretty much our entire main cast and we follow Chaol. He journeys to a new continent which has been mentioned but never visited in the series, and he's on a quest for healing and for answers. I mean, don't get me wrong, Chaol is a main character in the series. He is literally there from chapter 1 of Throne of Glass. But at this point in the series, a lot of the characters didn't love him, a lot of the readers actively hated him, and many more just thought he was boring. I'm sure there are Chaol defenders out there, but you were not the majority. It's okay though, Sarah J. Maas gave him some companions on this quest. We got the character of Nesrin, who is actually awesome, but we didn't really know her that well. And we also get the character of Irene, who, again, she's awesome, but we'd only briefly met her in one Assassin's Blade novella. So Chaol, a character that is very polarizing and not loved among fans, is joined by 2 characters that we barely know and no one is really invested in at the start of this story. You might think that this is like a parting of the Fellowship, Lord of the Rings moment. Frodo and Sam are off in one direction, Aragorn and his squad are off in another. We are 2 equally beloved groups of people off on 2 equally important quests. This is probably how Sarah J. Maas imagined it, because let me tell you, that lady loves Lord of the Rings, and you can tell when you read her books. But instead this feels like In Lord of the Rings, the stories swap to follow Gollum as he left the main fellowship dangling off a cliff, went off and made some new friends, and eventually returned with some rope to haul them all to safety. That might be a little harsh to Cale. I don't think he's a Gollum kind of character, but it was a weird narrative choice. This was, I believe, originally announced as a novella and then eventually changed to a full novel, and it immediately divided fans. People loved Cale, they were excited he was getting his own book, they hated Cale and didn't even plan on reading it, or they didn't give a crap and they wanted to stay in the main story. Some people even treated this like it was optional, because I don't care what you guys say on TikTok or Book Talk or whatever. Assassin's Blade was also treated as optional for much of Throne of Glass's original run, and people kind of thought Tower of Dawn was going to be the same. It wasn't. Don't get me wrong, I don't think Assassin's Blade is fully optional either, but like Tower of Dawn, you are learning so much information that is vital to the conclusion of the series and to the Sarah J. Maas multiverse as a whole. Here is my honest take on this book. I like it. I think it gets better every single time I read it, and there is so much here that I just think it's a really well-written book. Sarah J. Maas knew what she needed to accomplish going into it, and she did it. But it is still an insane choice to take readers away from your main quest on the second last book of your series. Thus, people developed the tandem read. It is a coping mechanism for people who could not handle Cale having his own book smack dab in the middle of what appeared to be an epic finale. These two books, as I said, do take place pretty much concurrently, so you could read, for example, 3 chapters of Empire of Storms, then 2 chapters of Tower of Dawn, and know that those 2 chapters took place at the same time, and very occasionally they will directly reference events that have just happened in the other book. As I said, it's a coping mechanism. I've never done the tandem read. I do intend to do it on my next reread because I think it's something fun, but it is insane. It is just so complicated. As far as I can tell, Sarah J. Maas has never commented officially on the tandem read. It is just something fun that fans came up with, and I think that's awesome. If you need to do this complicated, sticky tabbing tandem read nonsense to get through it on the first time, hey, that is awesome for you, and I do not think it affects the integrity of the story whatsoever. I just think it's a little overwhelming for first-time readers to be informed that they must do the tandem read to get the full experience when that was never the intention. But if you're like me and you reread the series often, it is awesome to have something like the tandem read that you can do to change it up. Chapter 5. What do the experts say? So we've established that the 2 main problems with the Throne of Glass series are where to read Assassin's Blade and the existence of Tower of Dawn. But what does Sarah J. Maas say? As I previously mentioned, she has never commented on the tandem read, but Tower of Dawn is required reading. So you all just need to suck it up and deal with it. Do the tandem if you want to. But what about Assassin's Blade? Well, if you go to the Sarah J. Maas official website, which was totally revamped in, I think, 2023 to this very insane pastel look. If you go to her Throne of Glass page, she has Assassin's Blade listed first. This is also where it is if you buy a box set. It is the first book out of that box. But if you're on her website to figure out what order to read a series in, you might go to her reading guide page. And on her reading guide page, Assassin's Blade is listed 4th after Heir of Fire, which aligns with the romantic reading order. If you're a little bit confused now, I would not blame you. The author is giving you 2 different answers. But never fear, because on that reading guide page, she has linked the official Bloomsbury reading guide, which she says gives more detail and info for fans who are starting the series. So let's click there, shall we? Except, oh darn, Bloomsbury recommends publication order, in which you are reading Assassin's Blade after Crown of Midnight. These are 3 different answers, people, from the only official sources we have. So moral of that story, no one has a clue. This was one thing that baffled me about my TikTok video. The number of comments saying, Sarah says do this, Sarah says do that, directly contradicting each other, because obviously they all just went to different tabs on her website where she gives contradicting answers. And this might be the problem when you write a YA fantasy love triangle series that becomes an adult high fantasy series without a clear plan from the beginning. Books that were never supposed to exist have to be shoehorned into the main series, and everyone agrees you gotta read them, but no one can agree when. Here's my horrible confession. The first time I read the series, I didn't bother to read Assassin's Blade at all, and I still had a great time. So what does that mean? How are we as readers supposed to pick up and recommend this series when literally no one can agree what order you read it in? Chapter 6. I'm more confused than ever. If you read Assassin's Blade first, you're wrong. No, that's mean. You're just making a mistake, and 2/3 of the official sources agree with me. I'm kidding, mostly. Just bear with me. Throne of Glass has been through kind of a wild ride. It started as a tropey YA love triangle story that became an 8-book fantasy epic. Along the way, it was rebranded into an adult series, tied in and then kind of shoved to the side to make room for her more popular adult fantasy, ACOTAR. And its identity had to shift multiple times, and Sarah J. Maas had to multiple times add new things to fulfill the needs of this series. That's why the prequels were republished. That's why Tower of Dawn exists. But I still believe it is Sarah J. Maas's strongest series, and the different reading orders can serve different purposes depending on what kind of reader you are. So, how do you decide? If you're someone who hates surprises, requires all of the information before you start anything, and also doesn't enjoy suspense, start with the Assassin's Blade. I am so sorry, but I am very vocally against this reading order. Personally, I can't think of anything less fun than spoiling all of the surprises of a series with a bunch of short stories and then trying to remember those details 4 books later. If you want the series to steadily get better with every single book for what is probably the smoothest reading experience, I would read it after Crown of Midnight. This gives you all of the context early in the series, following a major reveal at the end of the 2nd book, so you have all of the information moving forward, but you're not backing away from what will eventually become the main conflict of the series to go back and read a whole bunch of prequels. Or if you want to read it right before all of that information becomes the most relevant because you want it freshest in your mind, read it right before Queen of Shadows. Or you can be a chaos gremlin like me and just not read it at all your first time, but I don't recommend that because I was confused about soap. As far as the tandem read goes, I think this is really a to each their own situation. If you like sticky tabs, organizing things, feeling stressed, or you just really dislike kale, give the tandem read a try. If not, power through. It is worth it, and it is a good book that you will probably enjoy more than you expect. And despite what I have said here, don't let anyone tell you that you're doing the wrong thing. Not even Sarah J. Maas, because she does not know what she's talking about. Really, she doesn't. She wrote the universe. She doesn't know. The publisher doesn't know. No fan knows better than you do what kind of reader you are. But if you're really sure that yours is the nicest way to read the book, please leave a kind comment on someone's video instead of telling them that they're reading it wrong, because they're not, okay? And finale, I think it should be pretty clear what my Throne of Glass recommended reading order is here, so let's just go through it real quick. This is my favorite way to read the series. You are going to start with Throne of Glass. This is the weakest book in the series, but it gets you started in the universe. You meet the characters for the first time, and it is a fun read. Very nostalgic if you remember reading a lot of like 2012 YA books. Then you are going to read Crown of Midnight. It is the 2nd book in the series. Read it second. Now you are going to read Assassin's Blade. I believe in following the publication order of the series. It is the way these books were physically put into the hands of fans, and I believe it is the best way to enjoy the series. It ties in nicely to the ending of Crown of Midnight, but it doesn't force you to back out of the action once you're through Heir of Fire. It is a good, smooth reading experience, and I think this is the only way to love this series. Then you're just going to read the series like normal. Queen of Shadows, Empire of Storms, Tower of Dawn, Kingdom of Ash. I would not do a tandem read on the first time. I think I would find that overwhelming, but I really think that is a personal choice. The good thing about this series is there are multiple reading orders, so the next time you reread the series, you can switch it up and see if the vibe is different. I would love to know your guys' preferred reading order and what are your justifications for it. I think I did a decent job of explaining why people love these different reading orders, but I would still love to know what you think, because obviously I am slightly biased to how I experience the series. And of course, please hit subscribe and also check out my TikTok video where I talk books all day, every day. That was a lot.